Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up, 2021's weather was unremarkable, says the Met Office, but only because we're getting used to a rapidly changing planet. A U-turn in Washington could mean important progress for President Biden's climate agenda. And as gas prices soar and concerns over supply continue, how should the UK be looking to secure its energy this winter? Welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from those affected and report on the race for solutions. Now, sea levels are rising more quickly and warmer temperatures are the new normal for Britain. That's according to an annual review of last year's weather from the Met Office. Although the report says there was nothing remarkable about the weather overall in 2021, this is all in the context of climate change. The report goes on to explain that's because our perception of what's normal is changing. The report says temperatures last year, which should now be regarded as normal, would have been near record-breaking just over 30 years ago. All of the UK's top 10 warmest years have occurred this century, since records began back in 1884. The Met Office says the rate of sea level rise is increasing by around 16.5 centimetres since 1990. It also suggests spring is coming earlier, raising concerns that plant and animal life are not evolving quickly enough to adapt. Sky's Katerina Vitozzi has the story.
Today's Met Office report looks at last year's weather, but more crucially, its impact. 2021 was another year in a pattern of warming. That's changing things we take for granted.
Spring is getting hotter and wetter, and the seasons are shifting. Now, the warmer weather has really sped up fruit ripening and nuts forming. Now, what that means is, it sounds, well, what's the problem with that? But actually, that happening earlier can have a really disastrous effect for wildlife, because they may not have the food source available later in autumn when they need it.
So there's real jeopardy for some species here?
Yeah, there's real jeopardy, and we're in massive species decline already.
What's interesting about looking at last year's weather is, in some respects, how unremarkable it actually was. In 2021, there were no extreme record highs. But why that is interesting is that if you take that 12 months and look at it in a broader context, even without a record high, it was still one of the hottest years on record.
Look at this, at how much warmer 2021 was than the average hottest day of the year just a few decades ago. And remember, today's report doesn't look at this year, 2022, that has already changed the game entirely, with the UK average temperature exceeding 30 degrees Celsius for the first time ever. As climates change, extremes become more frequent. Last year saw Storm Arwen batter parts of the UK with high winds and snow. 8 months later, just last week, it was that blistering heat. Our natural world can adapt to gradual change, but shocks like extreme weather, in addition to our warming climate, could push some species too far, to a point beyond which they cannot recover. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
Well, as you heard in Katerina's report, the average temperatures in the UK are rising every year and we're getting less rain. This month is not yet over, but so far it's been the driest July in England since 1911 and the second driest since records began in 1836. Figures from the Met Office show that only 15.8 millimetres of rain fell on average up to the 26th of July. That's just 24% of the amount which would be expected in an average July. Experts are warning that if the dry weather continues, it means there will be a risk of drought, with people potentially being asked to reduce their water consumption. Well, to the US now, and after more than a year of negotiations, a US Democratic senator has stunned Washington by announcing a sudden support for President Joe Biden's top agenda item, a climate bill. Senator Joe Manchin made a joint statement with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, saying they've come to an agreement on new legislation addressing healthcare and climate change. Since last year, Mr Manchin has been using his pivotal vote in the 50-50 split Senate to force President Biden and the Democrats to abandon a more ambitious version of the bill. Well, Joe Pike joins me now from Washington, DC. Joe, this is really significant and great news for the climate.
Yes, and it was, Chloe, it's fair to say, a shock for some, a surprise for others. And for climate activists in this country who've been pretty despondent in recent months, it changes everything. It is a big reset in Joe Biden's climate agenda and his ambitions, his aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. Those aims, those targets look almost achievable with this new bill. Why? Well, because we're talking about billions of dollars of tax incentives to ramp up the production of wind, solar and geothermal energy, incentives to keep nuclear power stations open, but also incentives for lower income Americans to switch to electric vehicles. So why was it a surprise? Well, as you say, it's all due to one man, Joe Manchin, this Democrat senator from West Virginia, who has been proving to be a bit of a nightmare for Joe Biden, a holdout, and in this very finely balanced Senate, he has refused to back this until now. That, of course, has changed. It is good news for Joe Biden, and it also means the US can keep the pressure on other countries like China and Africa to keep up with their climate change commitments.
Joe Pike in Washington for us. Thanks for that. Now, let's get a bit more of the day's climate news now. Sections of the world's largest tropical peatland are being auctioned today in the Democratic Republic of Congo. 30 oil and gas blocks in the Congo Basin, which play a crucial role in Africa's climate system, are going under the hammer. The move is angering environmentalists who say oil drilling poses a significant risk to the continent already being affected by climate change. 7 people have been killed by lightning in a village in India's northern Uttar Pradesh state. It brings the total death toll by lightning strikes to 49 people this week. Indian officials say lightning has killed nearly 750 people across the country since April. Climate scientists believe global warming has played a role in the rising number of lightning strikes, with research suggesting a 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature increases the frequency of lightning by 12%. A £3.1 million tree planting package has been announced in London. It comes after record-breaking temperatures and wildfires, which destroyed homes and land in the capital. Mayor Sadiq Khan says last week's events have laid bare how vulnerable London is to the effects of climate change. Now, the National Grid has warned that concerns over gas supplies from Russia could mean periods of uncertainty over electricity supply this winter. Although it says it expects to be able to meet demand, there are renewed calls for the UK's energy network to reduce its reliance on gas and shift its focus to renewable energy. Well, right now, just over half of our electricity grid is supplied by renewables. That's solar, wind and hydropower, while nearly half is gas. And while millions struggle with the rising cost of living, energy giants have once again been reporting bumper profits. The parent company of British Gas, Centrica, saw half-year operating profits rise from £262 million to £1.3 billion. Meanwhile, Shell recorded earnings of around £9.5 billion for the 3 months to the end of June, more than double the £4.5 billion for the same period last year. Well, the firm's chief executive has been defending the figures and says Shell is now investing more money into its decarbonisation strategy.
We need to collectively as a society spend a whole lot more on the transition, and we need to work much harder to decarbonise the demand for energy as well. And that is exactly our strategy, decarbonising the demand for energy. The spending on it, Steve, we're spending about this year a third of our combined OPEX and CAPEX on the energy transition. We spend about $55 billion. A third goes to the energy transition. And if you look at 2025, it will be half. So we are definitely stepping up the investments there.
Well, let's talk more about this now. We're joined by Jess Ralston, Senior Analyst at the Climate and Intelligence Unit. Jess, thanks so much for joining us today. We just heard from Shell's Chief Executive there talking about spending more money on decarbonisation, but still, oil and gas companies are spending more money on fossil fuels than they are renewables.
Hi there. Yes, that's absolutely right. So the fossil fuel industry currently has plans to build 195 projects that would each result in at least 1 billion tonnes of CO2 over their lifetimes. So while companies like Shell and Centrica are investing in renewables, there's no doubt about that, their green investments are simply dwarfed by their fossil fuel investments.
And we have seen a windfall tax introduced by Mr Sunak, but of course that's not a permanent solution. It's going to be a really tricky thing for the next Prime Minister to navigate.
Yeah, the reality is the oil and gas companies are making huge amounts of profit from higher gas prices, while the public could see their energy bills reach nearly £4,000 this coming year. So it's easy to understand why the public think that a windfall tax is a fair approach. But it will be interesting to see how a new Prime Minister deals with calls from within their party to scrap it. I mean, getting rid of it so quickly after announcing it does create uncertainty. And, investors won't know if they're coming or going. So a longer term solution might be changing the tax system altogether to make it less lucrative in the first place for these companies.
And we're all watching the energy crisis unfold in Europe and no doubt wondering what it means for supplies in the UK. How do you see things panning out here?
Well, like you mentioned earlier, National Grid expects to be able to meet our demand, albeit with some periods where electricity margins are a little bit tighter because of the uncertainty with Russia. But what we have in the UK is actually a price problem rather than a security of supply one like the EU has. We're much less reliant on Russian gas and oil. But that being said, although we're an island, we're very tied to what happens in Europe because we're interconnected with their gas and electricity markets through our pipelines. So what happens over there to their prices also happens to ours. And we've seen our gas bills are probably going to be pushed up by about £2,000 by the expensive price of gas. So until we wean ourselves off it for good, we're almost certainly going to feel the pinch from the volatility in the gas markets.
And while you mentioned it's more of a price problem than a security problem, the UK still does need to secure its supply. What do you see happening in the short to medium term, sort of a bigger push for renewables?
Well, I think insulating our leaky homes is probably the most sensible place to start. I mean, reducing our energy demand so we don't have to find and pay for as much gas is very sensible, and it would help keep us warm this winter. And people are actually really keen to make their homes more energy efficient. They want to save money on bills, but they also want to help with stopping funding Putin's war. And in the medium to longer term, I think building out more homegrown renewables, so we need to import less gas, shields us from people like Putin turning on and off the gas taps when they like to.
Jess Ralston, Senior Analyst at the Climate and Intelligence Unit. Thanks so much for your thoughts on this tricky subject. Now, you can get more on this story and the rest of the week's climate news on The Climate Show with Tom Heap. This week, Tom will be taking a look at how we need to adapt our gardening habits to the changing climate. And Tom can put your questions to an expert. Just scan the QR code on your screen right now to submit a question and we'll do our very best to give you an answer on The Climate Show with Tom Heap on Saturday and Sunday at 3:30 and 7:30 p.m. Thanks very much for joining us today. That is all for now.